Okay, good morning all, and welcome back for week 3. Lovely to see you here. So, the last week we were looking at saving lives and how important that was if our goal is maximising happiness. The first week was covering what happiness is and why we should care about it. This week we look at how to improve lives, so how to maximise the happiness of people during their lives. This is what we're discussing, so how to focus on improving lives. We'll be looking at the current suggestions made by effective altruists, sort of Singer, McCaskill, charity evaluator GiveWell, who are the entities who have made claims about, or seem to have made claims about, what are the most effective ways to improve lives. I'm going to look at some assumptions that seem to lead to that conclusion, that global poverty is the place to put our money. And I'll explain why on the happiness data, building on what we discussed in week 1, mental health looks more cost effective as a way of doing good than targeting poverty. And then I'll end with some remarks on cause prioritization, so how we work out how our resources can do the most good, kind of more broadly, through using the happiness lens. And I'm going to identify some problems for cause prioritization methodology, but that's going to really come at the end. And the main effort of the lecture is just to look at the kind of assumptions that seem to have gone into the conclusion global poverty is the best way to improve lives, and picking those assumptions and then setting up an alternative. Okay, so if someone comes to you and says, I would like to and asks you sort of a slightly unusual question, an unusually specific question, I would like to spend my money to maximise the happiness of people who are alive today during their lifetimes, where should I spend my money? And you go, oh, well, there's this sort of effective altruist movement I've heard of, and there are some philosophers, and they've made some claims, and these to be the sort of things that they've said. So Singer and McCaskill largely take their suggestions about where to put money from GiveWell, who are an American charity evaluator, and the sort of things GiveWell suggests, the things we've mentioned in previous lectures, although I haven't mentioned all of them. So there's, on the top left, there's malaria-resistant, mosquito-resistant bed nets, which save children's lives. So we're not going to be speaking about those because that's the saving lives rather than improving lives. There's direct cash transfers. So on the top right is give directly. So people could be, this is in Kenya, people could be sent money directly to their mobile phone. Oddly, a more sophisticated way of banking than we have here, but there we are. And in the bottom, that's a picture of deworming. So another highly touted way of helping living people is to provide very cheap deworming tablets. So these are intestinal worms. I'm not exactly sure how people get infected with them, but that's sort of beside the point. And the idea is that by providing very cheap treatment pills to kind of a whole community, this is supposed to benefit the individuals and allow them to improve their health and allow them to go on and earn more money in later life, so they can for instance, attend school more. So one link is that people who are infected with intestinal worms end up not going to school as much because they have these other concerns. So if you treat them, they can go to school more, and benefits would be expected to flow from that. So in response to my specific hypothetical question, what's the best way to improve the lives of currently existing people? These are the kind of things which you if you looked at the effective altruist world, these are the sort of responses you would get. Okay, so which assumptions go into that? There are, of course, a huge number of things you could potentially do if you were interested in improving lives, making people happier during their lifetimes. You could be looking at, climate change. You could be looking at war. You could be looking at sexual exploitation, slavery. That there are other things in the list. So what makes us think that these ones have come up? So I think there are 4 assumptions which go into this. So one is that your money goes much further in the developed world. So that's a reason to focus your philanthropic endeavours on the developing rather than the developed world. The second is that quality-adjusted life years, which I'll say a bit more about later. QALYs are a suitable proxy for well-being. So these are we can look at QALY scores, and that allows us to work out which health interventions are better at increasing happiness than others. And kind of implicitly, the subjective well-being metrics that we discussed previously are not so good for, maybe not such an interesting way of measuring well-being understood as happiness. So that kind of gets us to particular kinds of, that gets us to those kind of particular life-saving health interventions, and also more to physical health interventions, but I'll come back to that. The third is that micro-interventions are better in terms of cost effectiveness than attempts to bring around systemic change. So some jargon here. So a micro-intervention is one which would just affect a small group of people without affecting, say, by contrast, an entire system. So providing deworming tablets helps those individuals, but doesn't say change the nature of health provision in the rest of the country, or stop people, or if you're, say, providing bed nets to stop people dying from malaria, then kind of the micro interventions providing the bed nets. The more systemic change might be wiping out mosquitoes or dredging swamps. So that's kind of affecting trying to get rid of the whole problem in some way rather than just deal with a part of it. So effective altruists have tended to suggest that the most effective ways to do good are focusing on these kind of individual and these kind of small scale, evidence-based micro interventions, as opposed to macro interventions or systemic changes. The fourth is that increasing the wealth of the poor is an effective way to increase total happiness. So effective there is, I'm actually wasn't quite sure how to set up this assumption. So one version of it could be that increasing the wealth of the poor has any effect on increasing total happiness, or is the most cost-effective way. I'm not exactly sure what the correct assumption here would be, but the implicit understanding is that increasing the wealth of the poor is better than any of the alternatives we could drum up. So that's what so these assumptions get us from the whole world to the developing world, focusing on physical health interventions, that's QALYs. I'll explain why that's the case. They're focusing on particular sort of small-scale evidence-based programs rather than trying to change the whole world, and then focusing on wealth as opposed to some alternatives. And what I'll now do is I'll look through these assumptions in turn. I will, as a foreshadowing, I'm going to say that I don't have particular objections to 1 and 3. I think those are fine. Or if they're wrong, I don't have any particular. I'm not going to offer you any reasons why they're wrong. I'm going to take issue with 2 and 4. And the reason I'm going to take issue with 2 and 4 is on the basis of what the subjective well-being data, they tell us a different story. It clashes with QALYs, and then it clashes with the effectiveness of poverty alleviation as a way of increasing happiness. So that's what's going to happen. All right. So why should we think that money goes further in the developing world? So McCaskill in 2015 is doing good better. I suggest there's a 100x multiplier, so your money will go 100 times further abroad than if you're a citizen of a rich country, and then if you spend it on yourself. So and there are some reasons to think that there's going to be a big difference between domestic charity and then developing world charity. This is a quote from McCaskill a couple of years later. According to GiveWorld, the Nations Against Malaria Foundation will provide a benefit equivalent to a year of healthy life, or QALY, come back to those, for $100 US. In contrast, the estimated cost to provide 1 year of healthy life by treating Kaposi sarcoma which is a sort of skin condition, is $50,000 US, a factor of 100 or more. GiveWell estimates that it costs $3,200 US to do an amount of good equivalent to saving a life. By contrast, government departments in the US are willing to pay over $7 million per life for safety improving infrastructure. So this to me sounds pretty compelling, but we can just end up doing much more with our money in the developing world than the developed world, because the developed world is already so much richer and has kind of taken the low-hanging fruit. So that was looking at health, and we can do the same analysis with income. So a similar picture emerges if we just compare the relative value of an additional dollar in rich and poor countries. Survey data and economic evidence suggest that life satisfaction, come back to that, is proportional to the logarithm of income. Every doubling of income is associated with a constant increase in life satisfaction. Since typical members of a rich country like the US are 100 times richer than the poorer 700 million, additional money going to one of these people will do 100 times as much to improve their well-being as it will to improve the well-being of a member of a rich country. So McCaskill, looking at life satisfaction data, identifies that for every doubling of income you get the same increase in life satisfaction, because people are in the rich world are something like 100 times wealthier than the poorest, the poor 700 million, that the differences will be about 100 times. So £1 to me makes roughly a hundredth of a difference as £100 to someone living in poverty, in kind of global poverty rather than UK poverty. So as I say, I don't have any particular objections to this. This is just one of the assumptions which goes into getting us into focusing on the developing world. Okay, the second thing is qualities. So I think I might have mentioned these in week one, but I don't know if I said very much about them. So qualities are a health metric, and the idea is that the score between 0 and 1. So sorry if this is familiar to you. So 1 would be perfect health, and 0 would be dead. There are states which are deemed to be worse than death, and what we see here is what we see here is there's person A who doesn't get a health intervention, and then there's who has the same profile as B, and then B does get the health intervention, and you can see how B gets all of this extra healthy life. So the idea is that at any particular point we can plot how good someone's health is. The more healthy life, the better. And using this, we can compare both the quality of lives at any point, and we can compare that with the quantity of lives. So what we're trying to do is maximize years of healthy life in this metric, through this metric. And how do we do this? In the quality system, the impact of I've got a long quote here I'm going to read out rather than put up on the board. The impact of a given illness in reducing the quality of life is measured using the replies of patients to a questionnaire, which is called the EQ5D. So patients with each illness give a score of 1, 2, 3, or 4 to each of 5 questions. So there's questions about mobility, self-care, usual activities, physical pain, and mental pain. And to get an overall aggregate score for each illness, a weight is attached to each of these scores. So for this purpose, members of the public are shown 45 cards, each of which an illness is described in terms of the 5 EQ5D dimensions. For each illness, members of the public are then asked, suppose you had this illness for 10 years. How many years of healthy life would you consider this to be as equivalent value to you? So the replies to this question provide 45 N evaluations when there are N respondents. These evaluations can then be regressed onto different EQ5 dimensions. So what happens here is that members of the public are asked to imagine how much of their life they would trade off for different things. So members of the public might say that a year with untreated AIDS is worth half of a year of healthy life. A year with depression is worth 0.3 of a year of healthy life. And it's through these kinds of things that the quality of illnesses, the badness of illnesses with regards to their health are compared. Okay, so qualities can be used to trade quality versus length of life through the method I've just described. But the question is this a good metric for happiness? So the qualities are asking us about, asking people to imagine how much of their life they would give up for different health states, but is this telling us how happy they would be, what would kind of maximize the sum total of happiness, where happiness understood as enjoyment or a positive balance of enjoyment over suffering. I should say that in reference to the last lecture, the quality metric is implicitly deprivationist about the badness of death. So we talked about 3 different accounts of the badness of death, and the quality one just says that the badness of your death is the amount of good stuff you would have lost, which is different from the other 2 accounts where, on the Epicurean view, there's just no badness to death, so there's no value saving your lives, or the time relative interest account where we're discounting the value of your future health by how connected you are to it. So that's just kind of it's not particularly essential, but just so we recognise the kind of assumptions which are being built in there if you happen to disagree with those assumptions. Although those particular disagreements are not germane for this lecture. Okay, so here are 2 problems with qualities, and qualities are a well-criticised measure, but here are my complaints. So the problem is that qualities are based on people's preferences over how bad they imagine various health states are, rather than how bad such health states are when they experience them. So I'm imagining Darius has some health condition. Maybe he's just too good looking, and this is ruining his social life. And I'm imagining, how bad is this for Darius? How much of my health would I be prepared to trade off if I were in his position? And which is different from Darius saying, oh well, look, this is, we could kind of follow Darius's life, and then he suddenly becomes extremely good looking, and then we see how his quality of life drops through his self-reported happiness scores, and that's how we could find out how he experiences this condition rather than how I imagine it. And the second concern, so the second concern is that if we're interested in happiness, health is just one of the things which can affect your happiness. So things like income and being in a relationship and being unemployed all can have impacts as well. And so a problem with the qualities is that they're not going to count these things at all. So even if we think they are an ideal way of capturing happiness, of health as it affects happiness, we're still going to need something else to kind of fill the gap for the other things we're interested in. But I'm really going to focus on the first problem. So the problem is that people imagine health states differently from how they are to experience them. So here's my killer piece of evidence. Dolan and Metcalf, 2012, report that subjects agreed to hypothetically give up as many years of their remaining life, about 15%, to be cured of some difficulty walking as they would be to be cured of moderate anxiety or depression. So I'm asking you, in each case, how much of your life would you give up? And people, when you ask them, actually say they're prepared to give up the same amount of their life. Now, the big differences between these is that you have some difficulty walking. This is an inconvenience to start having it, but you quickly get used to it. You give up running and you take up chess, and so you actually it's sort of intuitively obvious that this is the kind of thing that people will adapt to. You get used to it, whereas moderate anxiety or depression is more of a full-time health condition. It continues to bother you as long as you have it. So it's just kind of, if people are making this decision with regards to their happiness, I think it's sort of obvious that they're getting the wrong answers here. This just isn't a plausible account of which of those 2 conditions, assuming everything else is the same, is going to affect their happiness more. So, yeah. And then when the subjective well-being of individuals who have such health states is measured, so we find out how people who experience them, how bad they are for people who experience them, moderate anxiety or depression is associated with a 10 times greater loss to life satisfaction and an 18 times greater loss to daily effect than some difficulty walking is. So when you actually survey people and regress the various bits and pieces, moderate anxiety or depression is unsurprisingly just a lot worse to how it affects their life satisfaction, so 0 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life these days. Daily effect is going to be looking at people's emotional scores over the previous day. I actually can't remember exactly how this is measured because there are lots of different ways this could be measured. But so the daily effect is kind of basically equivalent to happiness. Life satisfaction is this overall judgment. So, but anyway, on both of them, it just has a huge difference. And we can see this here. I don't know how well this has come out now it's been blown up. But see on the top bars, we can see that this is how bad these different health states are with for the quality metric, and then on black bars, it's the life satisfaction metric. I don't have daily effect here. So I'm gonna draw your attention to the bottom one. So the bottom two. So this is mental pain. So this is basically how much it affects these are standardized to make them comparable. So even though life satisfaction is measured 0 to 10, it's basically put on a 0 to 1 scale, so you can compare them. So yeah, it has a much bigger effect than people say it does. So being unable to perform your usual activities turns out to be much worse to your life satisfaction than people assume it is. And then for some of them, people get them the other way around. So for physical pain, people assume it's worse than it is. So extreme physical pain, people expect it to be roughly twice as they disprefer it twice as much as it affects their life satisfaction. So this just shows that these two aren't the same, and the way in which they problematically aren't the same is, as I will say later, with regards to mental health. So the story seems to be that the effective altruist philosophers who have been setting out how we can do the most good with our resources have understood in terms of happiness, have used these health metrics to make their decisions, but these health metrics overweight the badness of physical health conditions, broadly speaking, compared to mental health conditions, because people aren't as good at imagining how bad mental health conditions are when they experience them. So we forget that we're going to adapt to many of these facets of physical health, and we forget that we are unlikely or unable to adapt to mental illness in the same way. So that's kind of the picture. So if you start with qualies, it sort of pushes you off in the physical health direction than if you start with subjective well-being, and we will come back to that. Okay. Right, so the effective altruist philosophers who've made claims in this domain have not used the subjective well-being metrics that I set out 2 weeks ago. And there's something a bit odd about this. So McCaskill, in Doing Good Better, states he is in principle in favour of well-being adjusted life years, so something which captures all of the facets of the things which affect people's well-being, although he doesn't specify what well-being is, over qualies as a particular health metric, as this health metric which we would use. So he agrees that the qualies are not the thing which ultimately matter; they're just the proxy. And he appeals to life satisfaction scores in another part of the book as evidence that our money does much more good abroad in the developing world than in the developed world. So it's not really it's not quite clear to me why the philosophers who have made these claims have not tried to use subjective well-being metrics, either the life satisfaction or the experience measures, to inform their judgments. But I think they should do, and I take this as kind of a friendly amendment to how we judge things. So I'm going to look at some possible objections to why you wouldn't use these, just to cover the hypotheticals. So here's some reasons why you wouldn't. So you might think that happiness is not all that matters. It's not the only thing of intrinsic value that's valuable in and of itself. And you might think this is a reason not to use self-reported subjective well-being measures, but presumably it is one of the things which matter. We do want to know how people feel during their lives. So even if you think that's not all that matter, that'll be one thing you consider. So let's say you happen to think that happiness and autonomy, just for simplistic concreteness, are the two things which have intrinsic value and the only two things. Well, you're not going to think happiness is the only thing which matters, but it is one of the things in your axiology. So you're going to presumably want to know how you're going to want to use the self-reported data rather than rely on our intuitive judgments of what we think is going to affect people's happiness. So everyone should use this somewhere. A second sort of objection is that you might think none of these subjective well-being metrics measure happiness. So we discussed this in week 1, so I'm not going to say very much about this. So the idea is there is this existing thing that we experience called happiness, and then we try and measure it by asking people how happy were you yesterday, 0 to 10, or how satisfied are you with your life nowadays, 1 to 10. And the thought is that this construct happiness exists, and our measures just aren't collecting information on it. So the measures are just telling us things which we know are nonsense, and therefore we can't trust them. But as I said previously, it seems like these are capturing the underlying phenomena of happiness. They do seem to be doing that. The third is that someone might push that subjective well-being metrics do in fact measure happiness, or they are proxies for happiness, but we can't make interpersonal comparisons. So me going from a 2 to 3 on a 10-point scale just can't be compared with someone going from a 2 to 3 on their own scale. So we've got different size scales. So that would be one concern, but as I argued before, it seems like we can make these comparisons. That seems to be the most parsimonious approach. And the fourth would be to argue that these metrics do measure happiness in some way, and we can use them to make interpersonal comparisons, but the data just isn't available yet practically to make such comparisons. So I think this is half true. So to the best of my knowledge, if you want to use experience measures, the things which I said before are the very closest to happiness, then there isn't really the information. You can't say how much, say, partnership or doubling of income or being unemployed affects someone's happiness on a 10-point scale to make these comparisons between individuals so that we can work out how cost-effective things are. But there is data now on life satisfaction, so we can use that measure instead. I agree. This is sort of somewhat frustrating. Somewhat frustrating. I think the thing which, if we're looking at our different subjective well-being measures, I think the experience measures are the things which, if we're interested in happiness, we should in principle care about. And the experience measures give different answers from the life satisfaction one. So if you ask people about their life satisfaction or versus their emotional affect, they give you different answers on the weekend on affect, but they give you but the time of the week doesn't change how people report their life satisfaction. Education has no effect on affect. Sorry, it's a bit clumsy, but it does on life satisfaction. And there are sort of other differences as well. So life satisfaction, how are you feeling about your life as a whole, and the affect measures, how are you feeling right now, these are different constructs and they give us different answers. So my suggestion is that in practice we can we should use life satisfaction measures as our proxy for happiness, even though they are not really the ideal measures we want, and that what we can, because we have the numbers on life satisfaction, as I'll show later, and that we should just kind of be aware of, we should be aware that we're using sort of a proxy measure rather than the thing which we really want. And we should kind of adjust, sort of remember this and adjust as a result. Another one is that people who are unemployed have reduced life satisfaction, but there's some German data which suggests that unemployed people do not have lower happiness. So if you look at all their time scores and you add up their kind of duration weighted happiness, they seem to be about the same as employed people. And this is because people don't like being at work very much. So even though they are, the unemployed Germans are less happy on weekends than the employed Germans because they're spending so much less time at work, which they don't like, their happiness is unchanged, or it's kind of roughly the same overall. So there are some differences which we need to be aware of, but not too many substantial ones. Okay, so this is another assumption which I think is reasonable, but here's the assumption and here's the accusation. So when thinking about how we do the most good, one, the effective altruist approach has been to focus on these small scale, empirically proven interventions, and a criticism is that when thinking about doing the most good, we should be focusing on changing the whole system. So here's Herzog. The current order is designed and maintained by human beings, and it is up to us collectively to reform them. Because of the focus on rational choices of individuals within the current system, this is the point that effective altruist misses or ignores. The underlying assumption of Singer and his colleagues, this is the underlying assumption of Singer and his colleagues. They take the current institution as given, implicitly denying it can be transformed. So if we're really interested in maximising happiness, perhaps we should be trying to change the world order, to agitate for communism, to overthrow capitalism. That might be a bit too radical, but maybe we should be agitating to change international trade laws which allow, I'm not an expert on these things, but allow American farmers to have their products subsidized and then dump them in poorer countries, such that those in developing countries can't compete with their agricultural produce. So if we're really interested in helping the poor, perhaps we should be looking at trying to change the whole world order rather than handing out one bed net or deworming pill at a time. So here's McMahon writing to the defense of effective altruists. Yet again, what these philosophers find objectionable is entirely appropriate. I am neither a community nor a state. I can determine only what I will do, not what my community or state will do. I can, of course, decide to concentrate my individual efforts on changing my state's institution, or indeed on trying to change global economic institutions, although the probability of my making a difference to the lives of badly off individuals may be substantially lower if I adopt this course than if I undertake more direct action unmediated by the state. So what McMahon is saying here is that this accusation that effective altruists should be focusing on changing the global economic system is misplaced. If we're interested in doing the most good, it actually we do more good by putting our philanthropic resources towards these kind of small-scale health interventions than by trying to change the world order, because our chances of changing the world order, I as an individual, are just so low. So I think this assumption is reasonable, although I do note a genuine and serious problem that it's very hard to compare the cost effectiveness of micro to macro systemic change interventions. So I've tried to do this. If you're looking up the cost effectiveness of of one thing to another. It's just so hard to think about. If I what would an extra $10,000 towards this policy reform program do? Well, it would go towards one person, and maybe it would pay a third of their salary. But how much difference would that person make in a political system? How likely is this to happen anyway? If I don't do it, will someone else? It's just the kind of qualitative decisions in looking at changing systems are just so complicated that it's very hard to compare these things. But nevertheless, I don't think it's unreasonable for the current suggestions to be regarded as plausible with regards to focusing on the small scale, micro rather than the macro interventions. Okay, so this is the fourth assumption, which I wasn't exactly sure how to word, but the thought is that one reason to recommend an organisation like Give Directly or other organisations which work on directly alleviating poverty is that if we make people richer, if we make some people richer, that will just improve happiness overall. And I'm going to take a much more pessimistic view. And even if you don't buy my pessimistic view that this might do almost nothing to increase aggregate happiness, I think you should still buy the less pessimistic view that it might not do very much, and that we can find something better in the guise of mental health interventions. But I'll just kind of motivate the skepticism for increasing wealth, increasing total happiness now. So this is a slide I showed in week 1. So this is the fabled so-called Eastlund paradox. So we see that the red lines are representing the wealth of countries, and the dots are representing the average life satisfaction. And what seems to be the case is that as whole countries get wealthier, their aggregate life satisfaction doesn't increase, and the explanation seems to be social comparison. So if a rising tide raises all ships, then my ship is no higher nor bigger than yours. So the effective income is not just my own, but it's my income compared to other people. So even though richer people are more satisfied than poorer people, and richer countries are more satisfied than poorer countries, if everyone gets wealthier over time, average life satisfaction at the very least doesn't seem to change. Or at least this applies in the developed world. So does it apply further down? So I think this is rather striking. This is data from China, starting in 1990 and going up to 2015. This is from four different data sets. So what we see here is that between about 1990 and 2010, at the very least, self-reported average life satisfaction didn't increase in China, even though didn't increase, and it may even have gone down. So the top one, the World Value Survey, FWS, seems to suggest it's still lower in 2013 than it was in 1990. But what's been going on in China at this time? Well, there's been radical economic transformation. So I think over this time period, China's GDP might have gone up 4 times, but yet life satisfaction seems to certainly not have shot up, and not obviously even to just be stagnant, but it might have gone down. So the explanation for this, I don't know if there is I think this is still an active research question, but the understanding I get from speaking to the researchers who work in this field is that very rapid economic transformation meant that people were moving around, and they're moving from kind of more stable jobs to kind of more fraught jobs in urban areas. They didn't know their neighbours. I think the social security system in China was being rolled back at the same time, so the jobs were less likely to be guaranteed. So even though the country gets much wealthier, because the sort of the fabric of society tears, that overall life satisfaction doesn't seem to increase. And then we have the pre-existing concerns with with social comparison. So maybe I get wealthier, but my neighbour gets even wealthier. So do I feel like I'm winning or like I'm losing? So if we're thinking, well, if we make developing countries much wealthier, that will definitely increase aggregate life satisfaction, I think we should just think again and be more careful. Right. So that's now the third step. Let's look at very low levels. So Give Directly provides unconditional cash transfers to Kenyan farmers, some of the world's poorest individuals. Yet, and there's been a couple of studies done on Give Directly using life satisfaction data. And so what Haushofer, Reisinger, and Shapiro find is that, so I should just explain this. So this was in a study where some members of a village were given cash transfers. They varied, but I think the average was about $750, which would be, it's roughly about a year's income. So giving us £20,000 or £25,000. And some of the recipients, some of the members of the village didn't get any money, the non-recipients, and they measured the life satisfaction over a number of months for both. And what they found was that while the recipients had their life satisfaction go up, the non-recipients had their life satisfaction go down. And the decrease in life satisfaction induced by transfers to neighbours more than offsets the direct positive effects of transfers to recipients. And this is largest for individuals who do not receive a direct transfer themselves. So even though lots more money appeared, the aggregate wealth increased, aggregate life satisfaction didn't seem to increase, because this has caused some to win and others to lose. So this might seem surprising if it weren't for the fact that these kind of social comparison effects seem to appear in all other bits of the data. As that seems to be the one explanation for why the Eastland paradox may be occurring. So we might be a bit more hopeful over the longer term. Maybe these negative externalities are just appear in the next few months. Maybe over the long term it's better. So there's been a Haushofer and Shapiro 2018. This came out just a few months ago. They looked at the 3-year effects, and they found that the recipients compared to non-recipients in distant villages, so not recipients and non-recipients in the same village, but recipients compared to non-recipients in distant villages, had 40% more assets than recipients. Had 4%, but the recipients did no better on a composite psychological well-being index. So this is actually a bit surprising. I mean, if they are wealthier, they should really have higher life satisfaction. So I'm not quite sure why this is the case. But on the evidence we have, it just it looks like this. It looks like this kind of the idea that there's this that even if there's this kind of short-term negative externalities, we're not seeing this long-term gain, which means that over the short term, it's unclear that there isn't a kind of a robust positive effect on life satisfaction, and over the long term there isn't a robust positive effect either. So it'd be nice to have more data on this, but that's what seems to be the case at the moment. So you might be sitting there being pretty skeptical of this radical picture I'm painting. So here are a few possible defences of poverty alleviation as an effective way to increase happiness. We've been using life satisfaction as our metric of happiness. So maybe we think there are long-term societal effects on increasing wealth. But this is exactly the kind of thing which the Eastland paradox and the data on China identified. So the thought here, just motivated, is that, well, maybe these individuals who receive the cash transfers, maybe it doesn't make such a difference to them, but maybe it increases the wealth of society over the longer run and more broadly, and that's where we find aggregate life satisfaction increasing. But as we've seen from the Eastland paradox in China, it's just not so obvious that really is the case. Another common thought is that while there are negative externalities, these will disappear if we just gave money to everyone. So I think, well, we gave it to half in a village and half not, so let's just give it to everyone on that village. But then there's the issue of social comparison. So if maybe we gave money to everyone in this village, then the people in the next door village would then feel worse if this social comparison effect is happening, which it seems to. So we think, oh well, let's extend this. Let's give money to both those villages. But now the problem in the next, and you can see how this goes on. What if we gave money to? What if we made everyone wealthier? Well, it seems like we'd end up with the kind of Eastland type results that I've already noted. So if that's the logical extension, it doesn't look like that sort of thing is such a promising response. Another thought is that give directly doesn't increase happiness because it doesn't target the very poor. So lots of people believe that at some very low levels, extra money will increase your happiness, but at kind of higher levels, those we see in the developed world, then it's just the effective income is relative. It's just how much you have compared to other people. But nevertheless, there is this absolute level. So at very low levels, it does increase aggregate happiness to make people wealthier. And the thought is that, well, maybe we see this at this level, but if we found even poorer people and gave them money, then maybe it's just that this absolute level is incredibly low, and give here, and we need to find even poorer people, and giving money to those people would really increase aggregate happiness. So I think this is, I find this plausible, but the response kind of concedes the argument that at least this particular way of, this particular method of increasing wealth doesn't seem to do very much, and we should look elsewhere. A fourth thought is that maybe the problem is that people are being given money. Maybe if they earned it themselves, they would have their life satisfaction would increase. So I don't know how plausible this is, because the main argument people make for cash transfers is that someone gives you money and then you can invest it in say some farming goods, and that allows you to earn more income. So it's the value is not in your, I give you £100 and you spend the £100 on having fun. It's that you invest the £100 and you allow yourself to earn more. So if that's true, then it seems like the effect that most of the benefit comes from income people earn themselves as a result of investment. And it's not really clear why you get a different result from this compared to giving someone a health treatment such as deworming, which would then allow them to go to school more and earn money in later life. One objection which I do think bites is whether we would get a different result if we looked at experience scores rather than life satisfaction scores. So I've just been talking in terms of life satisfaction because that's what we've got. As the economists often tell us, we are slaves to the data. So would we get a different result if we were actually measuring happiness in terms of moment-by-moment reports, or people just saying how they felt yesterday rather than through life satisfaction? So this is from Kahneman and Deaton 2008. Some of you may have seen this before. Kahneman and Deaton, this was a Gallup survey of 450,000 Americans, so the United States, and they asked them about they asked them a life evaluation question, which is the thick line. It wasn't actually life satisfaction, it was Cantrell's ladder. So in Cantrell's ladder, the person is asked to imagine there's a number of steps representing how well their life could go, and you're asked to place yourself on the step. It gives basically the same results as life satisfaction. But, yeah. And then we have some happiness measures. So these are the other lines. So people would be asked, I think it was a group of 6 questions. So So how tired are you? How enjoyable are you? How much are you enjoying yourself? I actually can't remember all of the details of these. So, but this kind of gave a composite mood score by averaging these questions together. And so this is kind of the positive domain. This is the negative domain. And what the study found was that so if you haven't noticed it, the key thing is that this is the annual income. This is household income rather than individual income. Is doubling along there, doubling along the bottom. So what what we see with the kind of life evaluation score, the thick black line, is that doubling someone's income seems to continue to keep increasing their life evaluation, but you need to double it to get about the same increase. Whereas when we look at the affect scores, we see these basically trail off around $65,000. This is again household income 2008. So maybe if you earned £25,000 yourself, or £30,000, you'd be kind of at this limit. And interestingly, if you get to the higher levels, just over here, you see that people who earn lots more money end up getting slightly more stress in their lives, which is perhaps not so surprising. So the picture this paints is that it is always better to be richer with regards to your life evaluations, because that's kind of a comparative judgment you make. Whereas getting richer will not becoming wealthier will not make you happier in terms of your past a certain point. Once you look at your if you're looking at affect scores, so this is where the measures more cleanly split apart. And the response might be that well, maybe if we looked at happiness scores rather than life satisfaction scores, we would find that Give Directly did increase aggregate happiness, even if they don't increase aggregate life satisfaction, because it seems to have some absolute effects. But so that's a concern which I need to say a bit more about before I come back to. Yes, I'll come back to it in a couple of slides. So the concern is that Give Directly, the concern isn't that Give Directly is a bad way of alleviating poverty, kind of individual cash transfers. The concern is that alleviating poverty is a bad way of increasing aggregate happiness, with the one caveat, which I'll return to. So if that's true, then the concerns for Give Directly extend to the other kind of GiveWell top-rated charities. So the Schistosomiasis Control Initiative, SCI, is a deworming charity which comes highly recommended, and charity evaluator GiveWell claim that only 2% of its benefits comes from the short-term health gains, actually from not having the worms inside you, and 98% comes from the fact that people, from eventual income and consumption, so people earn more later, and they can stay in school longer, they can earn more, and that's the benefit. But if we're just skeptical of how much impact increasing wealth has on aggregate happiness, then we should that even though these are health interventions, the same sort of skepticism would seem to apply. Right. So last few minutes. If we if we start with subjective well-being scores, mental health stands out very clearly as where we would start. So rather than either poverty or, as we found with QALYs, with physical health. So this is what's going on here. This is so these are how different kinds of life circumstances affect someone's life satisfaction on a 0 to 10 scale. This is from BHPS, is British Household Panel Survey, and what happens here is that these are the results from a multivariate regression analysis. So roughly you're kind of following the people along in this cohort, and then you see how different thing, and then you have all of these other variables, so you know whether they're employed and partnered, and you've also got their life satisfaction. So you use this to work out how much of these things each have an effect on life satisfaction, and these are the average scores. So on the left column is the effect on oneself, and on the right hand column is the effect on others. So doubling one's own income increases one's own life satisfaction by about 0.12. So let's say I was 8 out of 10 and my income doubled, I might be 8.1, but this has about the corresponding effects on a defined peer group. So we can see the effect of unemployment is bad on oneself. This is on life satisfaction, not happiness. So I mentioned the German concern earlier, and has a bad effect on others as well. And we see other things. So partnership seems to be pretty good. Being a parent has a tiny effect. I think that's not statistically significant. And the one which kind of sticks out is that people who are diagnosed with a mental illness. So this is from, the question would be, have you been to your GP and been diagnosed, versus not, have a 0.71 effect on life satisfaction. So that's kind of that's the big bit. So if we're starting with this is where we would look. I mean, the other place we might look is relationships. That seems to be a big effect. But it's not really clear to me, if I'm a philanthropic billionaire, what I can do to help people fall in love. I mean, maybe I could start some super efficient dating app, but that seems to be a reasonably congested marketplace. So, I mean, that just seems like the obvious place to start when we think about how easy is it going to be to make any impact on these things. Okay, so having been skeptical of the effect on poverty, I'm now going to be a bit more optimistic about an alternative. So, Strong Minds is a Ugandan charity which treats women for depression. So it provides interpersonal group therapy. So you can see this is kind of a picture, people sitting around chatting about how their lives are going. I don't have time to go into kind of the details of this, and it's not so kind of interesting philosophically, but from calculations I've kind of compiled from elsewhere, it looks like the effect treatment is about 0.2 life satisfaction points per person in the first year, so equivalent from taking me from like 7 to 7.2. I'm assuming there's some retention, so this kind of, you don't keep all of the effects in each year. I've got some information on the participant costs. So, using life satisfaction scores as our kind of unified metric of impact, a bit like we were doing for quality adjusted life years, putting everything in terms of the same units. So it looks like it's about 7 life satisfaction points per $1,000. And then information from Give Directly. So it looks like Give Directly might cause a 0.3 life satisfaction annual increase for about 1 year for 5 people in a household for $750, which gets you to about 2 life satisfaction points per $1,000. But this assumes we ignore the negative externalities. So I said that one of the main concerns is the social comparison effects, but even if we leave those aside and just count the good stuff, it still looks like on life satisfaction scores, treating mental health is more promising. The caveat I mentioned is that, well, what happens if we move from life satisfaction scores to experience scores? I actually don't think this. I think this strengthens the case for mental health relative to poverty rather than weakens it. So, when talking about quality adjusted life years and how they do in terms of subjective well-being scores. I said that in affect scores they had a bigger impact than they do in life satisfaction scores compared to what we say in qualies. So it looks like life satisfaction. So the mental health is worse on experience scores than it is on life satisfaction scores relative to other things, and income, it has a smaller effect on happiness scores than it does on life satisfaction scores relative to other things. So it doesn't look like, it looks like this would strengthen the case rather than weaken it for mental health if we moved from life satisfaction to happiness data. Okay, I'm out of time. I didn't know if I would get to talking about cause prioritization, and are there even better things we could be doing than on the ground developing world interventions for mental health. But I thought it'd be more useful to go through this a little bit more slowly. Okay, thank you very much. I will take questions if there are any. Don't be shy. Tell me what I was unconvincing about.
Yeah, I just wonder about this strong minds work. So I just wonder if it's something to take into account might be that it sounds like this is sort of a fairly newly researched area, and we kind of know that the first results that come out of any kind of research area tend to be more positive than what seems to transpire later on. So
yeah.
I just remember like with the effect of bed nets. People were saying initially, oh, you might be able to save a life every $100, and now it's gone to $3,000. So there's automatic change. And yeah, it's hard to say, I guess, what the effect would be here, but I just wonder like what should we maybe take into account, some factors to account for that.
Yeah. So in assessing this, I feel like I've already put in some discount. So I've discounted what strong minds think their effect is by a third. So there's kind of two stories to tell here, because it's a comparative question. It's how good is the anti-poverty stuff and how good is the mental health stuff. My story regarding poverty is just it just seems great, but now we put in this we use this metric which seems like we use this new way of judgment, so the subjective well-being scores, and suddenly it doesn't look so promising. So that's kind of the story I'm telling in that direction. So yeah, if I'm really cynical, the aggregate effect it's not obvious there is a robust positive effect. So it might be the case that as we dig into this comes down. So I think that probably will happen regarding the things we're aware of at the moment, but I'm optimistic that we will find much better ways of we'll find much more effective interventions for treating mental illness than the ones we're aware of currently. So currently it's kind of been me looking into this. I'm now forming a group to take this project a bit more seriously and to try and do some serious vetting of this currently unvetted terrain. But a backstory is that there's just mental health in the developing world is highly neglected, and so there just hasn't been very many efforts to run these sort of programs relative to total amount of resources going into physical health interventions and economic development interventions. So I think there's probably quite a few things which so if I'm thinking, are we going to find better ways to alleviate poverty? I think we're probably going to find less good ways, less interesting new ways than we are in terms of the mental health space, just because it's more sort of virgin terrain with less work that's been done. Yeah, so I would very well expect these numbers to come down. But I think what the subjective well-being scores do help us with is that they push us in a different direction to look at a new area, and so the current claims about how we can most effectively improve lives have made no reference to mental health thus far, which indicates the importance of the metrics we choose to try and evaluate these things, because on subjective well-being scores, I think they're like just, that's the first thing you would look at, and it's not something which has been evaluated thus far. Yeah, so who knows what will happen when the dust settles, but more digging required to get that dust up in the air to, Yes?
You, in the beginning, you quoted Michaelmas, where he said that you seem to agree with this, that if people get richer, they are more satisfied with their lives. And so every dollar spent in a developing country does more than a dollar spent here. So, and this seems to suggest that becoming richer makes you better off. But other data suggest that this is not the case, so I found it a bit confusing. It seems to be the case that there's disagreement about to what extent having more money makes you happier.
Good, yeah, I perhaps should have, so I maybe should have been clearer on that. So, so when looking at why your money goes further in developing countries, one of the things McCaskill reference is that on life satisfaction scores, because it seems like you're just looking at yourself, that for every doubling of income, there's a roughly constant increase in your own life satisfaction increasing. That suggests that, naively, it suggests that if we take money from the rich and give it to the poor, that will increase aggregate life satisfaction. But what that doesn't count on is the social comparison effects, these negative externalities, which are apparent in apparent in the Give Directly case, they're apparent in the Eastland paradox. So I just think this is, it's just looking at one side of the analysis. It's just saying, look, if I become wealthier, I will become more satisfied with my life, but what effect does that have on others? So unless we just aren't interested in these negative externalities, then we should bring this in. So that's the social comparison effect, which seems to show up strongly with life satisfaction. And then looking at happiness, sort of the experience scores of happiness rather than life satisfaction scores, then it looks like, and this was it's going to take me a while to get back to it. What's the next one? Yeah, so this one. So it's always better to be wealthier for your life satisfaction, because that's a kind of comparative, how am I winning at life judgment. But it stops becoming better to become wealthier for your day-by-day mood. So that's what this one shows.
True, but this is then only after you're already rather rich, no?
Yeah, so the concern the concern is basically what happens at the absolute level, and at the low levels. Is there an absolute effect? So there does seem to be an absolute effect here. I actually don't know what the comparison effect is for experience scores. That would be one thing to look into. But yeah, so there just currently isn't information using experience measures of subjective well-being, i.e. happiness, on programs like Give Directly. So that would be a great thing to know. As far as I'm aware, there isn't information on it. But as I say, I don't think it would change the story, because it looks like mental health has a bigger impact on happiness than it does on life satisfaction. Income has a smaller impact on life satisfaction. It has a smaller impact on happiness than it does on life satisfaction. If the life satisfaction, because as I showed that even on the life satisfaction scores, Strong Minds seems to beat Give Directly. It looks like this would just become more true if we move to happiness metrics.
Then as you mentioned, it is a bit surprising that Give Directly scores so poorly on increased life satisfaction. It seems not to be in line with some of the other data. So one would expect that at least for the people that receive the money, it would make them happier.
Yeah.
But even that seems not to be the case.
So I think another way of telling the story. I think another way of telling the story is that I'm going to see if I can go yeah, this one's going to be more helpful. Yeah, so this one, so another way of telling the story is that we think income had a huge effect on life satisfaction. It turns out that this effect is really small compared to mental illness, right? So the fact is that people don't spend that much time thinking about how wealthy they are, but if you're sad and you'll have kind of repeated negative thought, that just crops up the whole time. So there's this kind of this background idea that we're just not giving enough attention to our we're just ignoring the badness of mental health. So this is much worse than we think it is. This is much less good, just for oneself, leaving the social comparison aside. This is much less good than we think it is. So actually, the effects Give Directly have are much bigger than this. So it looks like from their data that the effect to participants is about 0.3 rather than 0.12. So it's having actually a really large effect comparative to developed country data on their life satisfaction. And as I say, I think the Give Directly, the sums of money are about a year's salary. So you might think it's about, so you'd expect it to be, so it's about 3 times bigger than we expect, looking at the developed country data. So that suggests there is this substantial effect at lower levels. But there's this social comparison which we also see, and it's just surprising it's so big. And the thing we've missed out is the effects of these kind of chronic attention-grabbing mental health conditions. Darius, did you have a question?
I did. Maybe I'm confused about something from last week, but I wanted to ask whether if we had a charity that extended someone's life who's already alive by a year, and this person had a life satisfaction of, say, 7 or 6, something like this, would this count as a 6 life satisfaction points generated?
Good. That would be an important question to know the answer to. So a challenge with the life satisfaction question is that it asks you, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? Where 1 to 10. But where on this scale is the neutral point? The point which is the point at which, if you were to live that for the rest of your life, would be as good as bad as being dead. So if you think, the kind of at a first pass, the intuitive way of thinking about this is that it's 1 to 10. So 5 is going to be, that's roughly the neutral point. So anyone below a 5 is leading a bad life. A life worth not living. But that might seem a bit strong. So the average life satisfaction in Kenya is 4.4. So that would suggest naively that if everyone in Kenya just popped out of existence, that would be good for those people. So maybe that we think the life satisfaction is a bit lower. So maybe the neutral point is 3 or 4. But to the best of my knowledge, there isn't any research yet on where it is, because people aren't asked to specify it. Maybe the neutral point is really 0, but so it's actually going to depend. It's going to depend on how people in fact use the scale, where they think that is. One approach would be to just ask people where they think it is, and that would give us some insight. And yes, it does make a very big difference. So if you think its neutral point is 4 versus 0, that's making a huge impact to the total amount of aggregate life satisfaction you're bringing about by saving lives, leaving other things aside. Another approach would be if you used something like experience sampling. So we measure people's life satisfaction, and then we also ask them to report their moods on a day-by-day basis, and then you work out which point on life satisfaction is equivalent to hedonic neutrality as measured by experience sampling. So the point at which people say, my life is hedonically neutral, report their life is hedonically neutral, you take that as the 0 point on the life satisfaction score. So I think that's actually probably the better way of doing it. And again, I'm unaware of any research done in this domain, but that might just be my ignorance, because I'm a social science dilettante trying to understand how this works for the purpose of doing applied ethics and working out how we should live.
Yes, so I was just wondering, about this point of, whether increasing societal wealth really, whether it increases life satisfaction or not. So I did think that it is a case that across countries, like the average life satisfaction score is correlated with the average income, which suggests that increasing wealth at a societal level should increase aggregate happiness. I just wonder kind of how can this be squared with things like the Give Directly results and the China study. I mean, one issue with that China study, I guess, is that it's trying to measure changes in happiness when lots of things are going on at the same time. So you might actually have a positive increase of income, but negative, and as you were kind of saying, negative effects will be these other things, and it might just be that's kind of masking the effect of increasing income. Is it really reasonable to think that increasing income won't do much to increase happiness in these countries?
I think you made 2 points there. So the one was, does the fact richer countries have higher life satisfaction than poorer countries suggest that if the poorer countries became richer, they would have higher life satisfaction? So that's kind of analogous to the claim that richer people within a given country are have more sort of life satisfaction than poorer people. So what you might think is that, and this does seem to be the case, is that people seem to know what's going on in the world around them, and the life satisfaction judgments we make are, in part I'm kind of comparing myself to the individuals I know, but in part I'm making this global claim. So maybe I'm living in Zanzibar, but I'm still kind of comparing myself to the life of Hollywood celebrities who I have some or the kings and queens of England, of whom I have some kind of some knowledge because of just the way news functions and so on. So this does seem to be the case, and if that's true, then there's this kind of global judgment. So I think so we can kind of move to just looking at this in kind of a global ranking, and it's just kind of position in the global ranking, which determines the effect of income has on your life satisfaction. So then the thing we want to see is, well, if countries get richer as a whole, or groups of countries get richer, does aggregate life satisfaction increases? And I don't know if I mentioned this in week 1, but there are some ongoing debates on this. So Stevenson and Wolfers have a well-known 2008 paper where they argue that the East-Lynn paradox. Did I mention this before? Okay. Well, they argue the East-Lynn paradox doesn't really happen, and what they do is they look at countries across the world, and they look at them over, and they say that basically economic growth is associated with higher life satisfaction, and so this is kind of taken as a repudiation of the East-Lynn claim. As I understand it, the response to Stevenson and Wolfers is that they are looking over periods of about 10 years, and it's not so surprising that if your country is growing, that will increase your life satisfaction because you feel like things are getting better. But the real thing we're interested in is over the longer time period, and over the longer time period, it doesn't seem like life satisfaction increases, and this just seems to apply to. I don't know what so the result seems to apply more broadly. I don't know if it applies to all countries going all the way down the. I don't know what the result is looking at time series for developing. So the result seems to apply for the developed world. I don't know. I'm actually not sure what the evidence is on the developing world. I can't remember off the top of my head, or even know if that's information has been collected. So. One way of getting into this is to look at the effects of this kind of wonderful randomized experiment, natural experiment that Give Directly have done to see what effect this has on individuals. But there is this kind of more complicated question to which I'd like to know the answer, and doesn't seem to have been that carefully investigated, as to how do people make these life satisfaction judgments? So what's actually going on in people's heads when they do this, and a kind of a deeper philosophical concern is that, well, maybe what's happening over time is that people's standards of life satisfaction are changing. So people are making different judgments. So if we care about how people judge their lives as going, okay, that like their lives are going roughly equally good across time. But maybe people are actually enjoying their lives a little bit more, even if they're judging them as going equally well on average. So maybe the world has got happier, even if it hasn't got more satisfied. It hasn't got more satisfied with its. People haven't got more satisfied with their lives. So yeah, this is a hypothesis I'd like to investigate, and I occasionally trying to bother some economists with. But the economists who work on this stuff tend to think that life satisfaction just is the thing which matters, rather than the happiness scores. So yeah, there are kind of some complexities that might. I'm not sure this changes the analysis today, but there are kind of some gaps in the analysis. Okay, all right, thank you very much.